our program this afternoon. Our speakers, John and Gail, have written now 3 books together that they've co-authored. If you came, I think it was 2 summers ago, John came and spoke about Grand River Avenue here for a morning breakfast program that we did. That was a book that John and Gail wrote together. The program that we're hearing today, Iconic Restaurants of Ann Arbor, of course, they wrote that. And then their newest book is Michigan Haunts, Public Places, Eerie Spaces. So they don't have copies of that one quite yet. It's coming out next week, is it? Yeah. So it probably, I would think maybe if you come back next fall to a Thursday tea at 2, we might be learning a little bit more about that topic as well. Gail has been an adjunct professor of advertising over at Lawrence Tech for about 5 years now. And John is the local author. If you came here for our ragtime and jazz tea a few years ago, you might remember John. He played the piano. He gave us some music history. Yes, that was excellent. Welcome back, John. All right, so without further ado, please help me welcome John Mylan and Gail Austin.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a beautiful day. We're so happy you're here. We are today, as Stephanie said, we're going to talk about iconic restaurants of Ann Arbor. Just out of curiosity, any people went to U of M or spent time in Ann Arbor? Raise your hand.
Wow.
Go blue, thank you. But we don't want this is a very inclusive program. I happen to be married to a Spartan, so I call it a mixed marriage. All Spartans are welcome. Go green, go white. It's funny, people have asked us about writing a book about East Lansing, and there are some wonderful restaurants there, like Coral Gables, for example, that have been around a long time. But why we wanted to write this book was a friend of mine moved to Ann Arbor, and she said, well, what are the restaurants there? And I said, well, I'll get you a book on it. There wasn't a book on it, so John and I decided to write it. As Stephanie said, we wrote a book together on Grand River Avenue. I always like to give a plug because people don't realize Grand River is the Route 66 of Michigan. It starts at the Detroit Athletic Club, goes west across the state. It takes different names, US 16. If you get on a car ferry and go to Milwaukee, you can take that same road all the way to Yellowstone, which is amazing. Most people have lived here their whole life and not known that you could start in Detroit, go all the way to Yellowstone, and you've been on one road. So that's what we do with our Grand River book. And then, as Stephanie said, we also are coming out. We're very excited about this. This is a book about all the places in our book are places you can actually visit. You know how there's haunted books that are in people's houses? These are all places in the Upper and Lower Peninsula that you can visit. Everything from asylums to lighthouses, places like the Whitney or the Holly Hotel, some of you may know about, even haunted bookstores. And so there's a lot of fun stories. But today we're here to tell stories about Ann Arbor. And also just interesting stories about food and historical places in Michigan. So there'll be a lot here. We hope you enjoy it. We always try and keep it fun and lively. And then at the end, we'd love to hear any questions or hear some of your food stories to share. So we're going to start in the book with a little bit of history about some of the places in Ann Arbor, the legendary and the long forgotten.
We like to start with the legendary and long forgotten because even though this is within living memory, we had to start somewhere around the 1920s, and that leaves all of us out, right? But there are still many restaurants around from that time period, but most of the restaurants at that time period are gone, and as is the case in many small towns in the restaurant industry at that time, a lot of the local restaurants were in old houses and old mansions. And we'll go to the next slide here. You'll see that 2 of the more famous ones were the Fawcett House, which was in a beautiful old mansion with one of those onion-topped cupolas, and also one called the Haunted Tavern, which was in an old house. Yeah, and speak of the devil. Yeah. And these were both on Huron, but if you've had any memories of Raja Rani, that was in an old mansion too, still is. So you know what I mean. A lot of these houses were set up that way. In fact, a house that is featured in our Haunted Michigan book is Shiro in Novi, which is a huge mansion also. So you know what I mean. Now in Ann Arbor, there are a lot of notoriety to some of these great watering holes and eateries. I don't know if anybody remember that song, I Want to Go Back to Ann Arbor Town. You remember that? Does anybody know that? Back to Michigan, Ann Arbor Town, back to Joe's in the Orient.
If we only had a piano for you.
If we only had a piano. So Joe's in the Orient were famous eatery, drinkery establishments. They are long gone, but they are memorialized in this song, and they were important places. They were places where students would fraternize. As Gail said, people ask about restaurants and places in other towns like Lansing or Jackson or Kalamazoo. Ann Arbor has the unique distinction of being a place where it just happens to be the campus and the public area, the business district are right next to each other, and there are more restaurants and more drink spots than you would find in almost any kind of area.
We'll get to it later in our program, but for example, it had 4 German restaurants at one time, and it still has 3 German restaurants. I mean, most towns around here don't even have 1 German restaurant. So that's another unique thing about Ann Arbor. And John's going to show you, as we go along, we're going to give you little tips, so the next time you go to Ann Arbor, there are things that nobody else outside this room is going to know. And here's one
right.
of them.
And Joe's, which was made famous in that song, there are still, if you're not an archaeologist, you still can find remnants of Joe's at the corner of 4th Avenue and Ann Street. In the doorway of this establishment you see there used to be the Catalpa Hotel. There is a mosaic in the doorway. It says Joe, and
It's down on the ground, actually. Let me,
Right.
Yeah, so it's actually, if you have to look down, if you're at that corner, and I think it's a running store now, it might be. I think it's a store that sells running clothes. You look down and there's this mosaic from Joe's. Well, Joe's went out of business in the 20s. So people literally walk by this. So if you're ever going to, for example, to the farmer's market, which is right there in Carytown, walk by there and point at Joe's and tell who you're with. Do you know what that's from? It's a restaurant that was around in the 20s. You'll seem very smart.
I believe it closed in 1921, so it's almost 100 years that mosaic has been there. That has lasted beyond.
Now, one of my favorite places in Ann Arbor is the Nichols Arcade, and it still looks just like that, even though that was, taken in the 40s. It's between State Street and Maynard, and there's all these wonderful shops in there. And one of their most famous restaurants was called the Betsy Ross Shop. Now, I went to school there in the 70s, and that was still there. This blotter is taken from the 20s, and it says broadcasting. I guess it's a little joke about women. Broadcasting. These women are all there gossiping. And yeah, I guess you could get away with that. But one of the things I love to point out is in the 20s, their most popular selling item was, and this sounds delicious, chocolate cake with chocolate frosting served with a side of chocolate ice cream and then a chocolate malt, all at once. And it still sounds pretty good. You could go, diabetics should not have that, but it does sound great. But that was their most popular item at the time, and it still sounds pretty good. You can even see on the right there's a little sign there that says candy that advertises the Betsy Ross.
Now, there's very limited space in Nichols Arcade, as any of you have been there know. So the secret to restaurants in Nichols Arcade, and there were 2 famous restaurants, there was Betsy Ross, and there was also the Arcade restaurant. If you see the photo above,
Yep.
you can see the neon sign that says Arcade. The kitchen to those restaurants was actually located around the back on the side of the arcade in a building we call the Shant. It's a historic structure that was built by William Jenney, and he was considered the father of the modern skyscraper. Now, that was originally the Delta Kappa Epsilon fraternity house, which was famous for giving us George W. Bush, I believe, and Gerald Ford.
Belonged to it as well.
Right. Now, a lot of people don't know that Division Street has another reason for being.
Another secret fact.
Another secret of the Ann Arbor restaurant world, or the bar world in this case. Division Street actually signifies the farthest you can get to University of Michigan campus with any kind of alcoholic beverage. At one time, it meant any kind of alcoholic beverage, period. And now that's become a little lax, but that was the dividing line.
Division was the dividing line between a dry part of the campus and the wet part of the campus.
Now, actually, you couldn't have hard liquor anywhere in Ann Arbor until the 1960s. However, before Prohibition, you couldn't have beer or wine near the campus. And when Prohibition came to town in 1918, actually 1917 in Michigan, you couldn't get alcohol anywhere in Ann Arbor as far as you and I were concerned. Right? But this wonderful song here is called Ann Arbor Will Never Be the Same. It came out in 1919, and it goes on with wonderful rhymes that mentions a lot of the food and drink places in Ann Arbor. And
It says the Betsy Ross here that we just saw. When Daddy comes across, we'll all cut loose at the Betsy Ross. They mention all these restaurants, the Sugar Bowl, places like that where you can get candy instead of drinking.
right. Now, when Prohibition was repealed in 1933, you had new businesses opening, and this is an ad we have here for the Dixie Barbecue. The Dixie Barbecue was on Washington, and if you look at this ad, you'll see that it says the nearest place to campus where you can get beer and wine.
Big selling point at the time.
Now, it's another interesting point that Gail and I found when we did our research for this book, that in Ann Arbor, a lot of these restaurants have survived for almost 100 years or more, or the places that had restaurants are still housing restaurants. The Dixie Barbecue is not only still a restaurant, it's still a barbecue restaurant, and it's called the Blue Tractor.
And there's one of those up north as well. I think it's in Traverse City. Now, one of the things they mentioned was the Sugar Bowl. This was on Main Street. This was owned by 5 Greek brothers, and they owned it up until the mid-'60s. And at the time they sold it, it was the oldest family-owned restaurant in the state, I believe. And it was the first place on Main Street to actually get electricity, and it's the first place to have a neon sign. It was a Greek restaurant that was also a candy store. Now, what went in when they went out was this place called Le Seine, and this was a fancy French restaurant back when there weren't many places like this. So this is 1966. 9 college professors who'd never run a restaurant before said, hey, why don't we all get together and make a restaurant, which is a bad idea. They spent $200,000, which back then in 1966, that's a lot of money. They had fancy crystal and very fancy glass and all kinds of wonderful things. They hired a French chef who trained under the guy who invented the crepe Suzette, this very fussy French chef, and it was a place called Le Seine. Now, it was a very expensive place. It had like duck à l'orange and Chateaubriand, very fancy dishes. You couldn't have a meal in under 3 hours there. And one of the most famous things about it is Ruth Reichel, who many of you have read her books, Tender at the Bone. She was the New York Times food critic for many years. She's written some wonderful books. She was a student at U of M. She would make $1 an hour at this restaurant, which is a lot at the time, but she'd take home $26 a day in tips. Which, 1966, come on, and it was such a fancy place. Well, unfortunately, 9 guys who don't run a restaurant, the restaurant lasted less than a year, and then it went out of business. So you could just imagine. But look at the menu is really beautiful, too. So it was sort of very of its time. As we like to say, Le Seine became Le Mort in less than a year. Now, here's another little tip that's very fun for you guys. People walk by this all the time. Unfortunately, as someone who spent a lot of time in Ann Arbor, I was very unhappy to see a CVS on State Street. But they did something a little different. You can see on the left there, and I'll do the thing, you can see that it says, it's hard to see, but this says Ritz, Dine and Dance. Look at this sign. This was a place that was a dining and dancing, mostly a dancing hall in the 30s. And CVS must have done some research, because look at the sign. It has those little wings coming out of it. You can see they imitated what was there before, which is really nice. Very few places preserve the history. So if you're walking down State Street and you see that sign, there's another thing where you can elbow your companion and go, you know what used to be here? The Ritz Dine and Dance, and the sign looked just like that. It's more impressive in real life. It's sort of a very Art Deco looking sign. Now, I'm wearing a shirt, of course, of a place that, guess what, this is going to give it away. When we were doing this book and we said, what was your favorite place in Ann Arbor? The number one place, and I know people will nod their heads, was the Pretzel Bell, and I'm wearing a shirt. Now, did anybody here celebrate their 21st birthday at the Pretzel Bell? Oh, sometimes.
Oh, what?
Wow! And you're still alive to tell the story, yay. And the reason I'm saying that is the tradition was, if you were turning 21 and you lived in Ann Arbor, you would go to the Pretzel Bell and you were supposed to drink 21 beers. And if you drank 21 beers and the EMS wasn't called, they would ring a bell and they'd give you a cardboard pretzel. Ma'am, did you have that happen at all? Okay. Well, thank God, because you're here today. day. I think if you drink, I can't even imagine. The Pretzel Bell was a really, that, if we have to say there's one restaurant that's iconic in Ann Arbor, it's the Pretzel Bell. It was a place where both people who lived in the town and students all celebrated. Teachers would be there. It was a gathering place. People would dance on the tables. They'd carve their names on the tables. I mean, it was a really incredible hangout. And John found on eBay, on the left there, you can see it's a bottle opener, very appropriate for when it first opened in 1934. You can see it's a bottle opener and a bell that you could ring, and it was celebrating it. Again, it was a wonderfully storied place, and you can see some of the action up here. And another story we love to tell is a professor of physics at U of M. His name was Donald Glaser, who spent a lot of time at the Pretzel Bell. Well, this gentleman won a Nobel Prize for physics in 1960 for something called the bubble chamber. And it was in a non-science way. It shows how particles become visible on the side of a glass, that they actually somehow become visible. And it is said that he came up with the idea for this while watching bubbles from beer going up and down a glass of beer. And those who, we interviewed someone who knew him and said he had very ample opportunity to repeat this experience over and over again because he would be at the Pretzel Bell all the time. And another thing we like to say is, drinking beer can lead to win to Nobel Prizes, okay? There you go.
The secret's out.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the Pretzel Bell, the Castor family, who owned this for many, many years, neglected to pay their taxes. And that was one of the reasons, unfortunately, that they went out of business in the 80s. And briefly, they also, if anybody remembers the Village Bell, that was also owned by them, famous for their sourdough bread. And John and I found an ad for them that says, "We pour the stiffest drink in town," which I think that's why they only were in business a couple of years. I think they probably went out of business. Now, there is a new Pretzel Bell. If any of you have been to Ann Arbor at all, at the corner of Main and Liberty, the old Parthenon, which was a place when I went to school, was a cheap Greek place that we loved. What happened, and this is an interesting cautionary tale, the people who owned the Pretzel Bell never trademarked it. So the trademark was out there. Anybody could come along. Someone did. They opened up, they bought a bunch of memorabilia online and opened up the new Pretzel Bell. They even have found the bell from the old Pretzel Bell. So people go in there, think it's the same family. It's not. We want to tell you that. People seem to like it. I've been there a couple times, but you know, it's like any other restaurant, nothing special. But the fact that they own the name gives them a lot of cachet. And after football games, it's incredibly mobbed. Now, another place that people remember fondly, including this woman over here in the back, we were talking about it, was this wonderful place called Drake's Sandwich Shop. It was I've got some nods over here, anybody? It was an old-fashioned candy store that opened up in the 20s, candy and tea. And it's so interesting, we're doing tea today. This place had hundreds of kinds of tea from all over the world in a time where nobody was drinking tea, right? Up on the walls, they'd have in the back wall there, you can see a bunch of tea canisters up there. And it was a place that never changed. It never redecorated from the 20s. My mother went to U of M in the 40s. I like to think that's her in one of those booths there. It looks just like her, and she smoked. It had these little wooden booths, and it was this wonderful place out of like a Dickens novel. And you could go and study there. And one of the most popular sandwiches they had there was the Stanford, and it was made out of, and I'm going to give you the recipe here, and you're going to go, really, that's a sandwich? They would take cream cheese and mix it with green olives, and they'd mix it together and put it on bread with Hellmann's mayonnaise and lettuce. That was their number one, I know, it's like, that was their number one selling sandwich. We have the recipe in the book, but I just essentially gave you the recipe. And it was a wonderful place to hang out, and they would, one of those old-fashioned places where they would take candy out of a jar, pour it on a scale and weigh it in a bag, and put it in a bag, those red and white, striped bags, like the awning. Limeade, fresh limeade, and it was owned, again, speaking of a Dickens novel, the name of the people that owned it was Truman and Mildred Tibbles. You can't make a name like that up. There's Truman Tibbles himself. They were always, I can picture them now, they would be sitting on the stools there. Unfortunately, this place went out of business in the 90s, and it became a Brugger's Bagel. Yeah. But it was such a charming place. It's sad that you think about Detroit, how they were able to save so many of these places. Their family didn't want to take it over, and all of a sudden it was gone after being in business for over 60 years. There's Truman Tibbles. He was a big friend of the cops in Ann Arbor, and he would leave the back door open at night so that the cops could, local police could come in and help themselves to whatever they wanted, and candy and things like that. And it was so popular that this sandwich shop was on 709 North University was the address. Well, at night, sometimes when it was a little slow in Ann Arbor, the police would call into the dispatchers and say, I'm going on a 709. And the 709 was a code that if you need me, I'm going to be at the back of Drake's and I'm going to be helping myself to a little candy. And there's Mr. Tibbles himself being honored by the police for his years of service to them. Another place that people remember very fondly is a place called the Whiffle Tree, famous for its prime rib. I have an ad here in the book from they were very famous for their prime rib and seafood buffet, just $13.95. So that was quite a while ago. It was a place that was a whiffle tree is a farm implement, and it was all barnwood. This was a place that when Vincent Price or Jimmy Stewart or Arthur Miller was in town, this is where they would eat. This is a place and it was so popular that on the weekends, the line to get in there would merge with the line to get into Old German, and people weren't sure which line they were getting into. It was so popular, but as I said, it was all wood, and it burned in the 80s, unfortunately, because the interior was all old barnwood. Another cautionary tale.
Another very popular place in Ann Arbor was called the Del Rio. A lot of people remember it very fondly, and it was opened in the 60s by Ernie Harburg and Rick Burgess. Now, Ernie Harburg was the son of E.Y. Yip Harburg, who was a famous songwriter who wrote the lyrics to all the songs from The Wizard of Oz, and he wrote Brother, Can You Spare a Dime, along with a great Michigan songwriter named Jay Gorney. Now, Rick Burgess was a piano player, and they just loved having this wonderful place that would often have live music, and it had this wonderful front entrance. You see the wonderful windows of Del Rio behind me, and very good friends and historians that have helped us in the past, Lars and Susan Weinberg, actually met there and got engaged, and they would celebrate their anniversary there every year. But if you look through the window, you'll see the brick building across the street, which was the old Earl Hotel. And the old Earl Hotel was renovated in the 60s, and that was when Rick Burgess and Ernie Harburg decided they were going to open a music place as well. So they opened the basement there, and they called it
The Earl.
The Earl, that's right.
For that. The Del Rio is also famous. It was a very kind of place where hippies would hang out, and it would have such a hierarchy that everybody had to agree on a decision. So sometimes deciding whether to get a tomato on your hamburger, it would take a half hour because people in the kitchen had to all agree on it. So it's just sort of its time. Another interesting thing about Ann Arbor and East Lansing as well is a lot of times people would come from out of town and they'd never seen something like a Korean restaurant. It had actually a lot of Korean restaurants in Ann Arbor. One of the most popular was called Steve's Lunch. We have it up there. We put in that picture because this dog is smiling at a thing that says steak dinners there. This was actually, it looked very... Another place when I was a kid and we'd go to Ann Arbor was a place called Leo Ping's. It was the first Chinese restaurant in Ann Arbor. This is taken from the 60s, and it said on their menu the most popular Oriental eating place in town because it was the only Oriental eating place in town. So, hey, I'm in advertising. It seems like a really good idea to me to say that. Now, one of the interesting things about restaurants in Ann Arbor is a lot of times people would meet, they would work together, and then they'd say, hey, let's start a restaurant of our own. Well, there was this wonderful place called Maud's over on 4th. And what's interesting about Maud's, it had sort of a turn-of-the-century kind of Victorian look, where 3 people met there, and they were Ari Weinzweig, Paul Saginaw, and Maggie Bayless. Ari was a dishwasher, and they were all just working in the kitchen. They went on to form Zingerman's. That's where they met. They just all worked there. They liked each other so much, eventually they went on. Everybody knows about Zingerman's. But the other thing I want to tell you about Maud's that I love is they had this thing called the martini salad. So I'm going to give you the recipe for a martini salad because it's like the best salad you're ever going to have. It's on the menu there. Here's a martini salad. It was a very, very well-selling item. You cut up raw vegetables, carrots and celery, and you put them on a plate, and then in the middle, you put a pitcher of martinis. And ladies and gentlemen, that is the recipe for the martini salad. That's the whole recipe. So there's a good way to get your vegetables, and that, as I said, was one of their most popular items. Up on the right, we have the Crack Crab, a famous place to get cheap seafood. John, and it was a tiny little place, and they used paper plates, and we couldn't figure out why. John and I have done this talk all over Michigan. We finally met the owners, and we said, why paper plates? They said, because we didn't have a dishwasher. It was so small. So we learned the secret of that. And we love the story on the bottom is Curtis's Chicken in the Rough. Now, the chicken in the rough, has anybody ever heard of chicken in the rough, or anybody ever eaten any chicken in the rough?
Yeah.
Okay. It was a chain started in 1936, so way before KFC. And their big thing, this was a national chain. It had 235 restaurants. They were famous for serving chicken disjointed. That would be in their ads, meaning it was cut up, which I guess was a big deal at the time. They would serve it with shoestring potatoes, French fries, a biscuit, and honey. That was their big thing, the honey. And there was chicken in the rough all over Michigan. This was the Chicken in the Rough on Main Street, Curtis's Chicken in the Rough. And now, after all these years, there is one Chicken in the Rough still left in Michigan, believe it or not. It's in Port Huron. You've been there at the Crystal Bar.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's worth the drive. Let's all get in a car right
Let's
now.
go.
And go to Port.
Buses are waiting.
Thank you. We very, very rarely encounter anybody. So if you still want genuine chicken in the rough, served the way it's supposed to. For a while, Hobbs and Ypsilanti had it. And they still have something like it. They still serve it with honey and a biscuit. But this was, and we met Mrs. Curtis. She lived to be 100. And we met her in one of our talks there. She was in the front row. So it was really an honor to meet somebody who owned one of these restaurants.
Now, a lot of people remember Tanos's Lamplighter, and this is kind of a sad story in effect, because next to Tanos's was the Encore Records. This whole block is about to become a high-rise, which is unfortunately the fate of a lot of businesses in Ann Arbor. Now, Tanos's Lamplighter was famous for its wonderful square pizza, which was kind of a novelty in those days, and people still talk about it. It was a favorite place of Gerald Ford. And when he became president, of course, he was a U of M graduate and a football star, but when he was president, he wanted to go back there and eat, and they would not accommodate him because he had to bring in the Secret Service and all of the entourage, and they said, we're not going to put our regular customers out for the President of the United States.
It was also where the U of M training table used to be. Here's a couple other quick places. Mr. Flood's Party, famous for its Tiffany lamps, and where Allen Ginsberg used to do poetry readings. And Bicycle Jim's is famous for a lot of the people from Zingerman's work there, and they had these wonderful fried mushrooms. And one of the guys who started Zingerman's used to go and work there, and then he'd go to class, he'd fry the mushrooms, and he'd go to class, and he said when he'd go to class, everybody would come over and sniff him because he smelled so great. He smelled like fried mushrooms. So we included that in there. Now here, does anybody remember Bimbo's, which was another famous place in Ann Arbor, for music and piano, and for John Milan's first piano gig?
There you are, right. I was 18 years old and I got a call. I went to Eastern. You didn't all go to U of M. And I got a call and they said, we need a piano player at Bimbo's tonight. And Bimbo's, for all of you who don't remember, it was a wonderful place to see old-time, 20s music.
Dixieland kind
Dixieland.
of stuff. Red and white striped vests, as you can see.
That's right. It was started by a man named Matt Chudik, who liked to call himself the Happy Yugoslav. And he had envisioned a whole chain of these pizza parlors with music, and you'd throw peanut shells on the floor and invite your six-legged friends. And it was actually the place where I first got a job playing the music. And he opened two of them in Ann Arbor. You see the one underneath it there was Bimbo's on the Hill, which took the place of the Village Inn and is now known as Paisanos. But if you remember when I did my lecture on ragtime and jazz in Michigan, there was a lady here who was a great pianist. Her name's Carrie Price.
And there she is right there sitting at the piano.
About 58 years ago, but that's all right.
And she's still playing.
And she's still playing, so there you go. But Bimbo's was a great place. There's no longer any Bimbo's in existence. There is, I guess, one in Kalamazoo that's unrelated.
But the reason it went out of business, as John said, about the throwing the peanut shells on the floor, it attracted rats and cockroaches, and the health department eventually put a stop to all that music. So there you go. Many people remember the bagel factory. There's still one in Southfield on Telegraph and 12 Mile. Famous for its thing called the Fraggle. Anybody ever have a Fraggle? There you go. Because a bagel's not delicious enough, you have to take a raisin bagel, you have to deep fry it, and then you have to roll it in cinnamon and sugar. They still make them, folks. I would recommend going to the one in Southfield. And then we have over here Geelong's Barbecue. You know, the format of this book is, unfortunately, you can only talk about places you can get pictures of. And here's a historical fact. We wanted to include more African-American restaurants because there were some in Ann Arbor, but this was the only one we could find a picture of. This was a place called DeLong's. It was down by the farmer's market, and it was popular because you can see in the ad they delivered until 2 a.m. So students really enjoyed it. It was a wonderful barbecue place. It closed in the early 2000s, and it briefly became a vegetarian restaurant, which we thought was kind of ironic that it was that. And a place on Packard called China on the Run, the only Hawaiian restaurant in Ann Arbor. And then does anybody remember Kale's Waterfall out on Stadium that kind of looked like the Flintstones? It had sort of a very futuristic sort of look.
This is an interesting place. Jimmy Kales was a man who lived to be 102 years old. He actually died a couple of years ago. He owned Pier 23 in Whitmore Lake. I don't know if you remember that. The sign is still there. It says food. But he decided that Kale's Waterfall would be his signature place. He had it designed to look like a spaceship externally and like a cave internally. And it was a jazz club. And his wife and his son played music there. And it was a popular place for many years until it became the Hunan Empire. Right.
Mm-hmm. The Rubaiyat was one of those places called a supper club back then. It was started in 1960. And the reason we put that up there was when John mentioned earlier about beer and wine, up until 1960, you couldn't get wine by the glass at all in Ann Arbor. And he went to Lansing and petitioned to have wine sold by the glass in Ann Arbor in 1960. And so he's sort of a hero for that. The Rubaiyat's also famous because when Madonna went to U of M, this is where he'd have disco nights in the 70s. And this is where Madonna first started to dance, was at the Rubaiyat when he'd have disco nights. She was at. He also started a place called the Oyster Bar and the Spaghetti Machine, which was a place that made its own pasta. And why we're showing you that picture on the right is he applied for a patent for the one-handed spaghetti fork. Now, we've never actually seen the one-handed spaghetti fork. We found this patent online, and we're sort of fascinated because, I mean, we assume it works. There's no moving pieces, so it was a good idea. But he was this guy that owned all these places. Not only was he a restaurateur, but he obviously invented things. The Round Table, which was near the courthouse, it was said that more cases were settled at the Round Table than actually at the courthouse itself. Afterwards, of course, Ann Arbor is famous for its vegetarian restaurants. There's still some. One that I love is Seva. You can see on the upper left there. It was on Liberty for many years. Seva, if you like good vegetarian food, it's still going strong, but it's out on Stadium by where Zingerman's Roadhouse is. Excellent vegetarian restaurant. And then Eden's on the bottom. It started as this little deli. Well, Eden's is a multinational brand. If you've ever bought any Eden's products, they make all kinds of organic foods. And that started as a little deli right there in Ann Arbor.
As I said, Gail and I discovered early on in our research that a lot of places that were restaurants were still restaurants. There's a very familiar structure that you'll find on the corner of Hill and State, which is behind me there. In fact, all of those are the same building, and they have been, it has actually been the location of a restaurant since 1922. It was the Chatterbox, which you can see on the top there, and we actually found a menu. It has a wonderful menu where you'll find probably the priciest item in the menu is about 92 cents. If you remember when 92 cents was a good round number. But it remained the Chatterbox until about 1968, and then it became the State Street Deli, and eventually the Quickie Burger. Now it's another restaurant. It just shows even our book has become obsolete. But it's all of these places that were restaurants remain restaurants. Another one is the Prickly Pear, which has been a restaurant since the 20s.
And we love that it says on the chatterbox, Duncan Hines wasn't here, or we would have told you so. Duncan Hines never ate here, otherwise we would have told you so. A lot of people don't realize Duncan Hines, the cake mix, he was a famous restaurant critic. I learned that by doing research on that. Here we are on Main Street again. Palio, which is an Italian restaurant, used to be the Quality Bakery, famous for its Long Johns and wonderful baked goods. And so now we have a thing in our book that says still here and going strong, talking about restaurants that have been around a long time. The Old Town is one of the oldest restaurant bars in Ann Arbor. It's been around since the 40s. It was built to accommodate the nearby factory. When guys got off the shift at 6 a.m., they needed a place to drink. I know all of you feel that way at 6 in the morning. So they don't have a bar that opened at 6 in the morning. You can see on the left, it didn't always look that nice. It's still family owned. It's a wonderful place for people from out of town to come to, the Old Town. And then the most famous diner in Ann Arbor is called the Fleetwood Diner. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It's a 24-hour diner. It was formerly called the Dagwood Diner in the 40s, but it's a really iconic place. It's like an Edward Hopper painting come to life. And it has a bathroom that I call the scariest bathroom with the best graffiti, if you get a chance to go there. But it's also noteworthy for the fact that President Obama wanted to eat there when he came to Ann Arbor, and they wouldn't close for him. Just like the Gerald Ford story, they said, nah, we don't feel like closing for the day. Our customers wouldn't like it. So it just shows no matter how famous you are, certain restaurants won't close. Now, another place that's very iconic is a place called Dominic's, which is near the Law Quad. It's this wonderful place that goes by the U of M football schedule. They open up when they close after the last home game of Ann Arbor in October, and they open up right after spring break starts, because it's sort of an outdoor place. But here's another one of these little tips we like to tell you. If you go in there and go upstairs, when the land Capitol in Lansing was undergoing renovations, they were going to throw out all their etched glass windows. Here's something particularly of interest to historical. These beautiful etched glass windows, and this guy went up there and rescued them, and he put them upstairs. And very few people go upstairs to look at these, and they're just on display, these gorgeous, from the 1800s, these etched glass windows. So if you're ever in Ann Arbor and Dominic's is open, and this is a wonderful place, they serve drinks in mason jars before mason jars was cool. It's upstairs in Dominic's. It's over on Monroe near the Law Quad, and it's definitely worth checking out. One of our other favorite places in Ann Arbor is La Dog. Now, this used to be in an old caramel corn castle place on Liberty, and now it's on Main Street, and it's this wonderful place that serves, it's like the soup Nazi from Seinfeld. They have a lot of rules there. They have 15 kinds of soup they serve every day. The lobster bisque is to die for. They're not online. You have to go there. You can't use a cell phone while you're in line. They've got a lot of rules. And he's this wonderful guy, Jules up there on the upper right, but he's kind of quirky. And during the 80s, during the art fair, when he was in this little place on the left, the people at Service's pop machine couldn't get through all the crowds, and they said, we can't bring you pop. So he took all his pop equipment and threw it on the street. He said, that's it, I'm not serving pop anymore. To this day, he does not serve pop. And he has a big sign that says, no pop, ever. So he holds a grudge. But you definitely should go there. It's only open during the day, during the week, like from 11 to 3 or something. No matter when you go up there, and hot dogs too.
Right.
It's a wonderful place.
And then a word of caution that would have come right from Jules Van Dyke Dobos. They do have a location on Main Street, right near where the Ark is, and that's their last location. But he warns everyone, you need to come down. If you get to Ann Arbor, you need to patronize these restaurants, because the small business identity of Ann Arbor is kind of disappearing, and the rents are going through the roof. In fact, on State Street and Main Street, it's $65 a square foot. If you can imagine how many hot dogs you have to sell for that.
It's very disturbing. Blocks that you remember, like where Ulrich's was, they're completely gone.
Yeah.
They've just demolished them, and they're building these high rises, and it's really a very alarming thing. That's why a lot of these places in the book, we tell people go to these places, because we don't know how long they're going to be around. And a surprising part of these that we've told you so far in the book, they're still open.
Right.
Here's a place that changed locations, but Blimpie Burger, was another famous place. It's now on Ashley. It's another place where you have to follow the rules. The Food Network's been there. Guy Fieri's been there. All these places, people have patronized them. And there's all these rules here. You have to know exactly how, you have to stand in line, order your patties here, your bun here, your fried items here. You have to order them all in line, or people stand there and literally look at you like you're some kind of rookie. And their motto is cheaper than food. Yeah. You have to be pretty confident to have that as your thing. So Blimpie Burger is a very famous place to bring out of towners.
It's so much a part of Ann Arbor that the person that took me there for my first hamburger was John Sinclair. So.
Here's a place I worked at in college. I made triple milkshakes and invented this thing called the Chapati Pizza Bob. Still there. We tell people to go there. During game day, they sell 300 pizzas. People love to go there. They used to have one next door called Pizza Bob's Uptown. And then look on the lower right here. You have to be talk about confidence. They had a place for a while called the Garbage Pit. It's not still in business, but we love that name, and it's still a wonderful, iconic restaurant.
Now, Gail made a reference earlier to the fact that there was once 4 German restaurants, count them, in Ann Arbor. And the reason for that, many people don't know, is that it was an originally German settlement. Ann Arbor was very popular with German immigrants, and it started with the old German and the Metzger family. They started Metzgers. They were all downtown at one time. Eventually there was the Schwaben Inn, which was kind of a local place for the old German folks themselves. And then eventually there was the Heidelberg. You see these wonderful guys, the singing group in the Lederhosen at the bottom there. Most of these are still in business, but there's a long storied history about these German restaurants in Ann Arbor. In fact, during the 1940s, the Ann Arbor News had to come to the rescue of Metzger's and the old German because people started the terrible rumor that all their profits were going to Hitler's war machine. Yeah, and they had to say, no, that's not what's happening. Now, Metzger's is still there. It's out, as Gail would tell you, on Zeeb Road. The old German has reopened underneath Grizzly Peaks. And the Heidelberg is still there, but I don't think these guys in Lederhosen are still around.
That's still open there on Main Street. And here the woman in front was asking about that. I mean, again, it's amazing that they still have 3 German restaurants in a town like Ann Arbor, a pretty small town. That's a lot of German food.
That's right.
Now, speaking of history, here's a case where, look at this beautiful building up on the left. It was almost torn down 3 separate times. And it's so iconic. It's the old train station. It was built in 1886, Romanesque architecture, beautiful stone building. And of course, it was the train station in Ann Arbor, which is now the Gandy Dancers, started by the very famous Chuck Muir, who unfortunately was lost at sea. But it's still a wonderful place to eat. You can see down at the bottom left how it looks. I highly suggest going there for any kind of occasion or no occasion at all. When it first opened, they had the waiters and waitresses dress up as if they worked on a train. So the men had to wear those caps and like overalls, and the women had to wear long dresses and bonnets. And every time a train went by, they had to sing, "I've been working on the railroad," which I imagine got pretty tiresome. They don't do that anymore. Although when trains go by, people still applaud, which I think is wonderful. And you can see up on the right there, people are waiting for people to, there you can see what it looked like probably back in what, John, the 20s? Is that picture?
In fact, if you look at the next slide, they're waiting for the return of the Wolverines after the Brown Jug game in 1920. This whopping score. This must have been a pretty exciting game. 3-0.
Yeah. Well, they won.
Yeah.
And on the bottom there, you can see in 1940 it was actually damaged by the train wreck. Well, of course, with modernization, they wanted to tear it down 3 separate times and build a brand new train depot, a modern depot. Luckily, they were able to preserve this building, and it is a wonderful, wonderful building. Please stop by there when you're in Ann Arbor. It's still very, very well run. Now, this is the oldest existing restaurant in Ann Arbor. This woman just went like this, the Brown Jug. Do you have good memories of the Brown Jug? This restaurant began in 1936. My Uncle Bob used to make donuts there in the window. In 1944, you can picture my Uncle Bob making donuts in the window there. This is the restaurant we're the most worried about. That block we think is going next, but go in there. It has old pictures of Ann Arbor in there. They have sandwiches named after football players. They have wonderful pizza. It's just, you feel like you're stepping back in time. And of course they have the brown jug, which is the trophy that you win.
Facsimile.
Yes. So, well, I don't know if it's the actual one, but it's a facsimile. It's a wonderful place, and it's still hopefully going strong. So we're just keeping our fingers crossed that that's going to still be there.
A lot of other famous restaurants that have been around for a long time in Ann Arbor, they're old standbys. Weber's, I'm sure a lot of you have been to Weber's. It's very popular for graduations. But Herman Weber started the restaurant in 1936. He was working for Metzger's as a dishwasher, and then he opened his own restaurant and eventually added a hotel. Now, Herman Weber lived to be 100 years old, and he was living in the hotel when he died. So.
We love stories like that. Like if anybody remembers Miller's Ice Cream, it's in the book, but we didn't put it in the slideshow. It was a very famous ice cream place. Mr. Miller, who was the farmer whose dairy provided all the milk for this ice cream, he lived to be 100. He ate ice cream every day. Every day. I always tell people that. 100 ice cream every day. Please do not stop eating ice cream.
Absolutely. And then there's Ray Knight, who started a meat market, and then he started a steakhouse, which is behind me on the right. And the steakhouse has grown to become a supplier of meat. They supply all the beef for all of the major restaurants in Ann Arbor.
And there's one actually on Liberty Nights, right downtown where Jacobson's used to be. And then on the bottom, the Cottage Inn, they were the first pizza place in Ann Arbor. And we know how important pizza is to students, folks. 1948 they opened. And they opened because when GIs came back from World War II, and a lot of them were stationed in Italy, they had pizza there. And when they came back here all across, that's how the Shakey's pizza chain, if you remember that, it started by somebody who said, gee, I love pizza over there, let's start a pizza thing. They're still in business, and many of you have Cottage Inns where you live. It's like a little mini chain. Now, look on the bottom here, Real Seafood Company. They came to Ann Arbor in 1975 on Main Street. At the time, picture this, Main Street was dead. This is when Briarwood was popular, a mall. This is when everybody was going to the malls. Nobody was on Main Street. If you think about Ann Arbor now, it's bustling, and Main Street is crazy busy with restaurants. They're still in business, and everybody told them they were crazy to go there. Well, it's a wonderful seafood place. They even had a little market inside called Monahan's, which is now in Carytown, a wonderful place to get fish. But it's interesting that has been hanging out on Main Street for so long.
Now, how many are familiar with Eggs Over Easy at Angelo's, which was a song made popular by Dick Siegel? You see him in the bottom here with his lyrics. Angelo, who's in the upper right there, was the founder of Angelo's. And it just so happened the restaurant that he bought was already called Angelo's.
Very convenient.
How's that for fate, right? He actually worked at Curtis's Chicken in the Rough. So you talk about this family of restaurants, and people who are part of it. Now, Angelo is gone, but his son, in the bottom left here, he still runs it. Angelo's is down near University Hospital. It's a wonderful place.
They make their own raisin toast, and it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And it's also great French toast, and a guy named Dick Siegel made a song about it as well. Now, also on Main Street across is Grazi's, which is an Italian restaurant, which is a great place, but it was the first movie theater in Ann Arbor. It was called the Orpheum Theater. You see, they still have a sign. It's not the sign, but it says 1911. And John found on the lower right a token from the actual, John went in there and tried to get a free dinner with it, but they did not give him a free dinner. No dice on that one.
They said I could see Tilly's Pictured Romance when it came back, but
right.
Yeah.
And we love to end on Zingerman's because we think it's the most famous restaurant in Ann Arbor. They just celebrated, they started in 1985, so that's
about 44 years.
Well, whatever. They just celebrated an anniversary. I'm scratching my head. That's not my strong suit. But people don't realize how famous this is. They're always talking about it in the New York Times. They talk about it all over the world. People come from all over the world, literally, to eat sandwiches there. And we learned a couple interesting things about them. This is Ari and Paul, who I said met at Maud's and decided to form a restaurant. They used to drive to Oak Park to the modern bakery every day to get their rye bread for their sandwiches. Obviously, they went on to start their own bakery, their own creamery, their own coffee place. Little by little, they started making their own things. But what's so unique about, besides their incredible sandwiches, is they never want to expand, okay? So every day, Ari told us, because he wrote the foreword to our book, he told us every day he gets dozens of requests. Please bring a Zingerman's to New York. Please bring a Zinger, all over the world. They care more about the quality of their food and their service than they do about, well, obviously, when you're paying $19 a sandwich, they're making money. Okay? As I like to say, don't worry about having a bake sale for them anytime soon. They're obviously, but food is very, very important to them, and they will never expand outside of their. I know at the airport they have a coffee shop. They have some of their baked goods, but
Right.
they will never put a restaurant outside of Ann Arbor. And it makes it interesting because it makes it a destination. This is the only place you can get it. But they also tell us a little secret. Look on the upper right about the lines. Every time you go there and try and get a sandwich at the deli, there's always a line. But they sort of engineer it a little bit, so even when it's not that busy, there's maybe not as many cashiers, so there's always a line, because if you drive by a place, there's always a line, you want to know why people are standing in line. So it's a little bit engineered, but it's a wonderful place to take out-of-towners. They have the Roadhouse out on Stadium.
Right.
And if you go out by the airport, they have all these other wonderful places. So we always tell people, this is the gem of Ann Arbor, and long may it rain, and long may all these other places rain. So that's where we come to, back to where we started. We hope you had lunch, because this tends to make people very hungry,
That's
this
right.
presentation. But we really, as John says, so many of these places are still family run, and they're really interesting places in history. So we encourage all of you, if you go to Ann Arbor, go to some of these places. Look them up in the book. Go on our Facebook page. We have recommendations. We have cards over there, so you can take our cards. We're selling books as well, but let's keep these places as iconic in business as long as we can.
Right.
So thank you very much, and now we're going to open it up to questions. And if anybody has stories they want to tell at all, yes.
The Creole Seafood place, is that the same outfit that's in Boston?
No, but that's a good question. It sounds like they modeled it on the place in Boston. But
That's wonderful.
yeah, but that's a wonderful seafood place too. They really
Very
do have
good.
very high quality seafood.
Isn't that owned by that whole network of restaurants that owns Grazie?
Yeah, the people that own Grazie and Palio also own real seafood.
Right.
And they're very high quality, Main Street restaurants. They're very, very high quality. Yes, sir?
I just wanted to mention that the Ridgeway Community Theater in Troy serves sandwiches after their performances, and one of them is a cream cheese and olive.
You're kidding! How is it? I've never had one. Is it good?
Oh.
Isn't that funny how tastes change over the years? Has anybody eaten a cream cheese and olive salad?
I have.
Oh, you have?
At Caruso's.
Oh, there, okay. That's a very old-fashioned kind of thing. Any other questions or experiences anybody wants to share at all about their Ann Arbor? Yes.
I remember a place called Red's that was there for a
Oh,
Red's.
Reds.
It's in the book, actually. We didn't have a chance to put everything in there, but Red's Right Spot was a very popular place on Main Street as well. You reacted to some of the places. Do you have any other favorite places that you remember from Ann Arbor?
Yeah, there's so many, and so many people have come up to us since the book came out and said, "What about this? What about that?" And it's like, we could actually do a volume 2, and it was a very popular book. It has been for us.
Oh, tell them the fact about Ann Arbor.
Oh, and the thing is, when people say, what is it about Ann Arbor and all the restaurants, and it's like, Ann Arbor is so unique on so many levels. And a great case in point, if you go out on Rand McNally's website and you put in the name of any town, put in Troy, there are probably 300 cities named Troy. There are probably 400 cities named Northville. There is only one city in the entire world named Ann Arbor. That's it.
There you go. That makes it. Yeah. Yes?
Ah, the Full Moon. Yeah, that was a wonderful place. And that was opened by a fellow that we also feature in the book.
Andy Galveston.
Andy Galveston. And he opened a whole chain of different restaurants at different times. Unfortunately, he passed away early, but he had some wonderful places. and we go into more detail in the
Yeah,
book. I
there's a
wish we had
picture of him
slide.
in the book. Yeah, we don't have a slide of him, but he's definitely
We certainly
in there.
don't have time in
He's
our
the man who
lectures.
brought craft beer to Ann Arbor.
That's right, yeah.
So did you work there at all? Did you have any connection, or you just used to go there?
My sister worked there when she was.
I heard that was quite a place. I heard it was a party behind the bar as well as in front of the bar. He used to have cheerleaders come in sometimes and stand on the bar and do cheers and all kinds of things. So we have a few stories in the book about that.
Absolutely. Anybody else? Going
Any other
once.
and East Lansing stories?
East Lansing.
Well,
Going
thank you.
once.
You've been a great audience. We have our books
Thank
over
you.
here for sale, but thank you so much. You really were a great audience.